We're getting these live images out of Los Angeles, so we're going to stick with these for now. National security analyst, retired Marine intelligence officer, and host of the Strat podcast, Hal Kempfer, is here. Hal, as always, it's good to see you. There is so much going on today. It's tough to decide where to start, but the protests are the live images that are coming in right now. You and I watched last weekend. It was another busy weekend last weekend for protests. The LA thing really kept going as the week progressed. We eventually saw a curfew being implemented in the overnight hours in downtown Los Angeles. And now we arrive to today. There's a nationwide movement of No Kings protests going on around the country. What are the chief priorities of the law enforcement officers that we're seeing manage these crowds, Hal?
Well, Austin, what they really want to do is they want to stop, obviously, any violence from occurring. What they've seen so far hasn't been a lot of physical violence against the officers themselves, although they have had certainly some confrontations. They've taken some people into custody. But they have seen quite a bit of what you see in the background there, a lot of vandalism. You see graffiti, tagging, broken windows, parts. There's certain areas you'll see where they boarded up and the windows and things like that. It's almost looking reminiscent of the protests in 2020 in terms of some of the activities taking place. And I should also mention, it's not just LAPD and LA County sheriffs. Certainly they are very busy with this, but Santa Monica, Long Beach, other cities have had impact in Southern California. And then there's other cities around the country. And today with the big parade, the military parade in Washington, D.C., that has become a kind of a culmination point for a lot of these No Kings protests. So you're seeing them spring out all over. But what they want to do right now is just to control this protest, make sure it doesn't get violent. They want to keep it peaceful. And certainly Mayor Karen Bass has said that publicly. Jim McDonald, the sheriff of Los Angeles County, has also come out and said that publicly, that they want to keep the protests peaceful, keep them within the, shall we say, the framework of the First Amendment, free speech, the freedom of organizing, and basically allow them to protest, but not allow them to do damage to physical structures, property, or to hurt people.
From what you've read, does it feel like, and it almost sounds kind of funny to ask, it looks like we have a reporter there, and again, we will have to work with what we have on the ground. Sometimes these live images are meant for the local news broadcasts, so we will see a reporter step into the frame every so often. What is this officer holding here, Hal? I'm not sure if you can tell, but that's a less than lethal piece of hardware, correct?
There's a lot. Actually, what you're seeing is a lot of less than lethal. One thing you'll see a lot of things out there. For example, the ability to deploy, things like smoke and either something like pepper spray or something, or basically to it's a less than lethal way to disperse the crowd. When they get hit with the tear gas, they tend to disperse. I don't know if you've ever been hit with tear gas. In the Marine Corps, we do that it's a similar thing. We do it as part of our training all the time. And that does tend to disperse the crowd. And sometimes it's a technique to intersperse gas or smoke with tear gas. For the crowd, they see a much bigger cloud, but it's actually not quite as potent, if you will, but it visually has an effect, and sometimes that'll disperse the crowd faster. I have seen them use gas on the streets. In fact, you just saw gas right there that whiffed by. Also, they're using non-lethal rounds that they're painful, and certainly if they hit you in the wrong place, they can cause some serious damage. But they're generally less than lethal rounds that are used to disperse a truly unruly or violent crowd, where they basically work through all the other ways of deterring them, and then they go to that. That's one way to do it. They tend to be very reticent to use those because they know that if they hit the wrong place, and they're not firing a non-lethal round from a marksmanship standpoint is not quite as exact, certainly at distance, than firing other types of rounds. So when they fire
right that they aim it at the ground sometimes?
They do, and that's to absorb some of the impact. Obviously, the crowd will feel the round coming in. If they're in the crowd, someone's go, oh, and they got hit. But what they didn't get hit is the lethal round directly. It actually absorbs a lot of the energy by hitting the ground and then bouncing up. Of course, you can imagine if you thought aiming a non-lethal round was challenging, doing a bank shot with a non-lethal round is a very inexact science. So sometimes people get hit and they get hit in the face or something like that with these rounds, and it wasn't that the officers were firing directly at them; they were firing at the ground or something to basically make a statement, to absorb the impact, to lessen the impact of the round. But in doing so, they also have less less control of where that round's going to actually land, so to speak, or where it's going to actually impact.
It's not uncommon for reporters, by the way, to know what tear gas feels like. I've been to many protests in my day. I've been lucky enough to never feel the effects of pepper spray or anything like it. You say you have before. What does it feel like?
It's generally unpleasant,
Generally.
stinging. Generally, that's why they use it. Obviously, with your eyes and your nose and stuff, that's where you get the most effect. You're tearing, hence the term tear gas, watery eyes. Your nose tends to run a lot, and a lot of coughing. It's very difficult to breathe, and it basically incentivizes anyone to leave that area. That's why it's used, is because it just makes it very difficult to breathe. Now, when you see protesters out there, and not the media is very, I got to tell you, the media, the press that's on the streets, they know this stuff inside and out, especially in Southern California. They will show up with, they have gas masks, they will take those with them. They're prepared for that. But if you see protesters showing up and they've got gas masks, and the other thing you'll see, if they don't have a gas mask with a visor, they'll often wear some sort of basically eye protection to avoid the gas. For one, it'll actually, depending on how it's wrapped around, you can avoid gas getting in your eyes, but also to avoid any non-lethal or less than lethal rounds or anything like that. So that's very common, and sometimes wearing helmets. But when you see that, some of them, and I can't tell you off the top of my head, but there are some who are what we sometimes refer to as professional protesters. Antifa, which is that sort of it's short for anti-fascist organization. They sometimes have what are essentially professional protesters. They find events like this and they will kind of embed themselves within there. They will also try to influence or control the crowd in such a way to cause the maximum disruptive effect, try to defeat law enforcement tactics dealing with civil disturbance. Now, there you see them. It looks like they're ready to fire gas, is what it looks like to me at this point. And by the way, you notice that the non-lethal weapons are painted something quite different. In this case, are painted, I should say, or have a different coloring. They will often be like lime green is very common. Certainly, you'll see with tasers. Sometimes they'll be yellow. I've also seen other colors used for tasers, and that's to let the officers know quickly and immediately that when they just do a double check to make sure they're not using just to kind of visually double check to make sure that they got the right weapon. Now, with this weapon, it's so unique. It's hard to imagine they could confuse it, but trust me, when you're in an intense situation, all sorts of things will happen. It also is a signal to the crowd that non-lethal means are being used, or less than lethal means are being used and ready to go. And the crowd, especially the professional protesters I was kind of referring to, they certainly recognize these things. They know the weapons and tactics being used by civil disturbance, anti-civil disturbance uh, uh, law enforcement personnel. So they're very well aware of this, and they're able to spot that right off. And of course, they're trying to figure out what tactics should they try and move the crowd and stuff like that. By the way, I should mention LAPD has as does Los Angeles County Sheriff's, very long history of knowing how to use these crowds or maneuver these crowds in such a way. They certainly know the streets. I would say much better than the crowds know the streets in terms of where they want to move them, how they want to move them around. So they're positioned in such a way to get the maximum effect, to contain the crowd, and to basically draw down the energy of that crowd and disperse them in such a way that they can't coalesce mass and cause potential violence in a significant manner. So they're very smart. You know what's interesting? As you know, I'm overseas right now, and it was interesting. I was over in South Asia, and a government official there pulls me over, and he's talking about the protests, and he says he was asking. He says, "Now the protests are because immigrants don't want to be forced to go home back to their home countries." I said, "Yeah, basically." And he said, "Why are they flying the Mexican flags?" That was a very interesting observation. That was from somebody in South Asia, kind of looking at that. And I tried to kind of explain it. Says, well, it has a different meaning, in the U.S. or Southern California. But it was rather interesting to hear that perspective from the other side of the world, which is, if they don't want to go home, why are they flying a Mexican flag? Why aren't they flying the Stars and Stripes or something patriotic? And I just thought that was a rather interesting comment to get from completely the other side of the planet on that.
So Hal, and by the way, our producer Jonah here popping this up saying, and this was just from the past 10 minutes ago, a curfew is in place tonight from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. downtown Los Angeles. This is an identical curfew to what we've seen in nights previous. That means that anybody that's out there past 8 p.m. within the curfew zone is subject to arrest. This is what we've seen earlier in the week. I think you make a good point there, Hal, and that's something that I think is worth putting a fine point on. There's a good amount of our viewers that are watching from other parts of the U.S. or perhaps other parts of the world. Can you explain, I'm from Southern California, you live in Southern California, why is the topic of immigration, of ICE, of the Trump administration, why is this such a passionate subject for this population in L.A. specifically?
Well, in LA specifically, it's because such a large percentage of the population overall are immigrants. I think it was within LA County, and this is not illegal immigrants, but within LA County, it was estimated about 1 million of the population there was about were immigrants. They come from all over the world. It is truly one of the great melting pots, if you will. It's a very international area. From all over, not just Mexico, but obviously due to proximity and a lot of other reasons, Mexico, Central America, South America. Obviously, it's a main conduit into the Southwest. It's the largest city in the Southwest, and there's a very large degree of employment, particularly if you look into service industries and stuff. When you get into things, it's kind of, I think there was a Steve Martin movie about this at one point, but the amount of landscaping that goes on, people that take care of people's yards, frankly, a lot of immigrant and honestly, a large number of illegal immigrants. Same thing in the construction industry. That's when this thing kind of kicked off. At least the report was that ICE had gone down to a Home Depot, and that's very common in Southern California, that you will find those basically day laborers that will line up ready to get hired to come and do work at people's homes or businesses or whatever as day laborers. And they don't have any of the protections of regular construction employees, but that's a very common practice, is to pay them with cash and do that. So, but a lot of them are illegal immigrants. And so there is a lot of illegal immigrants, disproportionately so, probably more, I would say probably more so in Southern California than most other parts of the country. And that is why there is this fervor with this. There's also a lot of, what I would say within the Hispanic, I should say the Mexican American community, there's a lot of pride. There's a lot of pride in being from Mexico. And so it's not uncommon to see them flying the Mexican flag because they're very proud of their heritage, where they came from, all that they've accomplished. And, then there is a tremendous amount to be proud of with that. So it's not uncommon that they will fly the Mexican flag as part of that, albeit to other countries in the world, it causes a little bit of confusion because they're saying, well, wait a minute, don't you want to stay in the U.S.? So why are you flying another country's flag? And it's kind of very much a Southwest, more, I wouldn't say necessarily Southern California, but maybe Southwestern California sort of thing, where it's very common to see the Mexican flag portrayed in such a way. And of course, Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, is a major holiday in California and other places, and that celebrates one of the Independence Days in Mexico, which would seem kind of odd that in the U.S. there would be such a huge celebration for a Independence Day in Mexico, which is my recollection was independence of Mexico from France, and I'm not going to go into all the history on that, but that is a major holiday that takes place. You often see very normally you'll see a lot of displays of Mexican flags or flag of Mexico. So that's one of those things. I just want to point that out. Is this is one of those things? It's almost kind of unique. You would certainly would seem almost counterintuitive when you see it visually.
Getting this in from the LAPD Central Division. Sadly, they say at Broadway and 2nd, agitators are throwing rocks and other objects at the officers. Hal, all this does is create more complications for the people that are trying to protest peacefully, and obviously it creates a whole lot of danger for not only the officers, but also the people that are out there protesting. Correct, Hal?
I want to say, yeah, not only that, but if they're throwing rocks and if, rocks, and then commonly they'll pick up bricks and throw those as well. Now you're into physical violence. Usually that's considered assault with a deadly weapon, because a rock or a brick or anything like that can be used as a deadly weapon. And if it's being used in such a manner, obviously it is being used. And they can not only arrest those individuals, but they can arrest them and charge them with a felony, usually assault with a deadly weapon, or worse, depending on what happens. God forbid. So, and by the way, when they're doing that, it changes. It's no longer a protest. Okay, it's immediately the moment you have, and I do crowd manager training for a variety of different things, like in Las Vegas, I do a lot of crowd manager training. And there are certain things definitionally, if you have a big crowd in place and you see a few individuals doing, violence to property or persons, by definition, because that crowd is there in place, when you see that threshold get crossed, it has by definition become a riot. And it may seem a little counterintuitive as in that regard, because you normally think of a riot as a lot of people doing stuff. The reason is you have a highly agitated crowd, very energized, and once you see that threshold get crossed, it can really move exponentially through the crowd and become a very uncontrolled situation. So that's why a lot of times when they look at this, it would not be incorrect when they see stuff like that to say, okay, this turned into a riot. And you may say, well, it's only a few people throwing stuff. Yes, but you have an agitated, energized, crowd that could immediately turn and start picking up these same tactics, if you will, or picking up the same sort of approach towards dealing with law enforcement, and of course dealing with the physical environment around them. And that's one of the reasons that you'll see law enforcement move very quickly with this. And of course now you see someone holding up their hands, holding up a white shirt with kind of like a surrender thing or something like that. Well, that's fine, but if you see people on the other side, throwing rocks or doing something like that, or picking up sticks and charging or whatever, and I don't see any stick thing. I just kind of point that out as something they could do. Then that means that the crowd itself, despite that one individual, the crowd as a whole has kind of changed the threat assessment perspective of law enforcement because of what they're doing.
So, Hal, a lot has been made as we watch this skirmish line move forward, by the way. It looks like they're trying to move protesters as we speak. Hal, let's talk about the, I guess, the national and the federal response to what we've been seeing in Los Angeles. A lot has been made about the deployment of the National Guard. A lot has been made about the deployment of Marines to Los Angeles. For those unaware, Hal Kempfer is a retired Marine intelligence officer. To your understanding, Hal, up to this hour, what have those people largely been doing, the National Guardsmen and the Marines?
Security, pure and simple security, protecting federal property and for protecting federal personnel. And that is not a unprecedented. I have to tell you, the use of the term unprecedented has been rather unprecedented, if you will. I've seen that headline constantly. I will tell you this: going back to the founding of the republic, military has been used for security and protection missions within the United States. That is not something unusual or strange. After 9/11, you may recall there were National Guard troops at the airports, armed, walking around. All right. And we've seen we saw them certainly at all the military bases. You saw National Guard troops. Guard troops can be deployed to federal property. What you're seeing is the National Guard in California. Not the entire National Guard, but about 4,000 were mobilized and federalized, which means they were put under what's called Title 10 authority, which means they're federal troops. Now, the National Guard, just to clarify, is not the governor's personal militia. Yes, when they are not in federal status, they fill constitutionally what's called the state militia. In other words, they give the governor a military force that they can use for a variety of purposes, to include if Governor Newsom wanted to use them to deal with the protests. Theoretically he could. Not theoretically, he actually could activate under state active duty, under state funding. He could activate the National Guard and he could put them on the streets of Los Angeles. And not only could they be used for civil disturbance stuff, but they could actually potentially be used to conduct law enforcement missions under state authority. Under federal authority, they are limited. Under federal authority, there's a thing called the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which says that federal troops cannot be used for law enforcement. And that was something that came out of the Reconstruction period, where federal troops were being used for law enforcement after the Civil War. That is the law of the land. The only way to get around that would be the president would declare the Insurrection Act. And if it's an insurrection act, certainly it would be scrutinized very closely by the courts and Congress to make sure there was an actual insurrection that met the criteria to make that declaration. President Trump has used a lot of language, rhetoric, as has Secretary Hegseth and others, which basically has been interpreted that they were kind of considering invoking the Insurrection Act. I think President Trump may have even said he was absolutely considering invoking the Insurrection Act. To my knowledge, he has not done so. And the troops right now are guarding federal property. They're at federal courthouses. They're at federal buildings. They're at other federal property. I even think I had a report that federalized National Guard troops were even at a federal military base in Los Angeles near LAX. Used for security there. So I thought that was rather an interesting application. I don't know if they're being used at other military facilities throughout Southern California, but it would seem a logical thing for them to do. Then the other thing they're being used for is protection of the ICE agents, or those assigned to do immigration raids, immigration enforcement, if you will. They're being assigned for protection. And in that role, some of them have actually detained, not arrested, but detained. And under federal law, it's long been established that in that security mission, certainly, they can detain people. They can't arrest them. They can't charge them. They can't do any of the other law enforcement things that would be prohibited by by law, I should say. But they can detain them, and they have done that. They have detained them, and then they expeditiously as possible turn them over to law enforcement for law enforcement to do what law enforcement has to do. And that has happened. And those are kind of that's what they can do. Now, the courts right now, there was one federal judge, I understand, that said, nope, that President Trump should not have been able to federalize the National Guard troops. And now the appeals court is apparently reviewing that. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is looking at that this weekend. I have no doubt that will go to the Supreme Court for review. But what I will say is this: historically, presidents have mobilized, federalized National Guard troops on a regular basis, and in the global war on terror, with Afghanistan, Iraq, and other things going on around the world, we were federalizing National Guard troops all over the country all the time to go to stuff. And I don't recall anybody having to go to a governor and say, "Can I mobilize your National Guard troops?" It was just on a regular rotation, and the state was certainly informed. But I don't remember anything in there. I've never heard of anything. And I should mention, I'm not just a retired Marine intelligence officer. My last duty assignment was coordinating military support for civil authorities. And I was in that role, near as I could tell, I was the lead Marine in Los Angeles County for doing that. And I interfaced with all the agencies involved in that role. And yes, we did activate Marines and put them in Title 10 Marines to to actually provide support to civil authorities and providing missions. It wasn't this; it was firefighting missions. But so this is, despite all the heated rhetoric and everything else around it, yeah, it's unusual, but it's certainly not unprecedented. And they have not been used on the streets of Los Angeles. That's LAPD, that's law enforcement. It's Los Angeles County Sheriffs, and certainly if you go to the other cities, their PDs are on their police department personnel on the streets dealing with the protests. But that's who's dealing with the protesters on the streets. If the protesters were to surge and go on federal property where there are national, federalized National Guard soldiers or Marines present, it is possible they could come in confrontation with those federalized troops. And the Marines, as I understand it, have undergone a fairly extensive package of civil disturbance training that they've been doing. I know one of them was, by all reports, at a naval base just across the line, Seal Beach Naval Weapons Station, just across the line south of LA County. They were doing pre-deployment training, and I got reports today that some of those Marines have actually moved up to the federal building on Wilshire, up the 405 freeway. And when I say 405 freeway, you and I understand that. Other people would say, "What? That's okay for us, the country. I-405. Okay, it's a freeway, big freeway in Los Angeles."
Us Californians just say the 405.
That's the way we
Anybody
talk.
who's watched Saturday Night Live knows it.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, we are the Californians. So
Yes.
anyway, that's how we talk. But they're up there at that point. They're up there, and I believe the National Guard was there. But that's probably to let the National Guard redeploy the forces elsewhere. And by the way, there were also pictures of National Guard troops sleeping on the floors. All right, and I saw those things. They're all over the internet and talk about, oh, they didn't prepare for this and whatever. I should explain that troops will sleep wherever. Okay, and sleeping on a clean floor certainly is better than some of the places I've had to sleep at times. Certainly, look, let's put it this way: they weren't going to get a room reserved at the Hilton or the Marriott for the troops being deployed in Southern California. Whatever it was going to be a little bit Spartan, shall we say. If they're there for a long period of time, I'm sure they'll bring in more stuff like, cots and stuff like that. But that is not an exceptional situation that you would have troops sleeping on the ground. That's kind of certainly for the infantry. That's kind of what we do when we're deployed in the field, so to speak. And so I know a lot of people are shocked by that, and they'd probably be more shocked if they saw some of the other places we have to sleep. So anyway, that's just kind of what it is. It goes with the business.
We've been watching the movements of these officers, Hal. I gotta wonder if there's any sort of, these guys have been out here thinking about situations like this now, these officers, for a week now, possibly a little longer than a week. Did they build muscle memory? Obviously, these guys are trained and they've gone through rigorous training. But when you go from protest to protest, day in and day out, do you build a little bit of muscle memory? Does the operation itself get a little more tight every single day? I mean, I think this is day 8 now that we've been seeing this. So does the crowd dispersal tactics get stronger? Does the crowd management tactics get stronger? Or do these guys pretty much go through the training and they follow the orders and that's that? Or does it get better over time?
Well, what a lot of it is, yeah, absolutely. The more you do it, the better you get at it. The more intuitive those movements become. A lot of these formations, certainly this isn't something they do on a regular basis. Although in Southern California, we do have protests, and you can't forget that 5 years ago we had massive protests because of the George Floyd, the George Floyd killing and everything that came after that. There were massive protests, and actually one of the things noted 5 years ago was that there were some significant mistakes that were made, errors tactically by some of the law enforcement entities. And a number of us who've been around for a while with a lot of gray hair, we kind of looked at it and they said, I think some of that muscle memory may have lapsed. And a lot of it is with the newer officers, they, if you say, remember 1992? Many of them will turn around and say, I wasn't born in 1992. So, no, I do not remember 1992. They certainly weren't involved with it. And so a lot of those tactics, they don't get used on a frequent basis. So a lot of them are things that they studied. They may have done some training on it, but it's not something operationally where they did it day in and day out and built all that muscle memory. Now you have probably at the mid level and upper levels, you have officers who have done this before. Oh yeah, okay, I remember we did this, we did that. They have been refreshed with certainly if talking it through, if not actually going out there and working through some of these formations before. So they're feeling more comfortable. Also, the other thing, I don't know if you want to call it muscle memory. I would call it basically threat appreciation or understanding, if you will, is that they're understanding this particular crowd. They're getting out there and seeing these crowds or seeing what these crowds do. And so they have this immediate recognition of, oh, they're starting to do this or they're starting to do that. In other words, they're they're picking up on the tactics, techniques, procedures being used within the crowd. And even though the crowd may look like a spontaneous event, normally within them there's some of those, some of them maybe those professional protesters that I discussed earlier that are kind of orchestrating, if you will, shouting out commands or doing something to get the crowd to go in a certain direction. And obviously, law enforcement picks up on those sorts of things, and so they can kind of more intuitively react. Even though it's not necessarily the individual, it's not like playing ice hockey or something where you instantly know where to go in terms of positioning or whether to you know do an assist or something like that. It's one of those things where the folks in charge, everyone kind of knows what's going to be told to them, and then it is told to them, and they know how to react. So the other, you could call it muscle memory. They're just becoming more proficient at this particular type of operation over time.
Hal is the host of the Strat podcast. You can listen to it wherever podcasts are available. We do want to take a quick commercial break. The other big story that we're following tonight is Israel and Iran. We're going to take a quick commercial break. Hal will be sticking with us. Just about 10:30 in the nation's capital, just past 10:30, just past 7:30 out west where we've been watching those protests. Our coverage continuing in a moment.